Now, prescribed assets, or a situation where investors are forced to assign a portion of savings to asset classes such as government bonds and state-run entities, is a policy some say has echoes to the apartheid era here in South Africa. Is this policy ready for implementation here in South Africa? Well, let me introduce my guest today. Shaun Hagedorn is an independent strategy advisor and is joining us from Cape Town. And Francois Conradie, a political analyst at NKC, independent economist, is also joining us from our studios in Cape Town. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Let me begin with you, Shaun, because I think there's no running away from it. The global environment has become a little harsher for South Africa given the dependence on commodity prices. What does the government do in respect to trying to fulfill its own obligations, or does it forego those while just trying to make sure the economy survives the current squeeze in commodity prices?
Right, so the status quo is really not an option, and basically the economy is reliant on two primary sectors. It's domestic consumption and then the extractive sector. And both of those sectors, the long-term trajectory is much less appealing. And so from a fiscal and a trade deficit perspective, the long-term looks much more challenging. And so certainly the government officials must be debating among themselves various policy options.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about this idea around prescribed assets, where government tries to encourage the private sector and also direct states' resources to investing in particular industry sectors. How does the government balance that? Obviously, each government has got its own ideology, but at the same time, you need to take into account your environment where you are operating in.
Right. It's interesting you use the term ideology, because this is really going to bring a clash of ideologies about. You're going to have the capital markets sector, the asset managers, much more directly taking on the ideologies of the government policies. The credit, really the credit rating agencies would take a bit of a step back. And the reality is the government would have to come up with a prescribed asset regime, which is pretty complicated to do, and a lot of ideology would come forth in that. And then the capital markets participants, the people responsible for people's pension funds, would have to respond. So you'd have a clash of ideologies for sure.
Francois, from your perspective, are we getting a situation here where perhaps ideology is trumping rational economics, especially in a hostile environment? Or do you get the sense that the government has got a clear strategy and they are actually capable of implementing it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I think government's got a clear strategy, but I don't think ideology is, that ideology is turning into disastrous policies. You know, the ANC was elected on a leftist platform to transform the economy. That is its mandate, that's what it has to do. It's its role to play. Now, the ways of doing that, there are more and less productive ways of doing that. And I actually think that under the influence of what's been happening, splits in the labour movement and the emergence of the EFF, the ANC is actually moving to a less of a statist ideology, if you want to call it that. They're looking more at other options than just simply setting up a state mining company or a state bank, which is why I think that what Shaun's talking about, the prescribed assets rules, that's a realistic scenario. I think that's something that they can implement, which serves the transformation agenda without being, old school Leninist.
Are those options well thought out in your view?
Well, I don't know to what extent what options the prescribed assets. I don't know to what extent they've been thought out. I haven't seen any clear policy documents, and it's a very complicated business. So I don't. There will be some unintended consequences and some mistakes being made. Yeah.
Shaun, let's talk about this prescribed asset legislation that has been talked about. I mean, there are other countries where this has been introduced and it has worked. Perhaps just give us an idea of where it has worked and where perhaps how best it could work in the South African context.
Right. Well, in the South African context, in the old regime under the National Party, they had quite aggressive prescribed asset regimes in place. And there's many variations on the theme in terms of how you go about it. And whether it could be successful, I mean, that's a tricky word, how you define success. I mean, South Africa's current trajectory is non-viable. So the country has to have another sort of political, economic regime or structure. So you wouldn't ideally go down the prescribed assets approach, but the reality is the tripartite alliance is generally hostile to big business. And this would be one way of transcending that, I think, is the most positive way of putting it. It's a risky way of doing it, but it could still, at the end of the day, be successful. It's possible it could net be quite successful.
But the danger, of course, is with these prescribed assets is that, yeah, you may ask pension fund managers to prescribe into these instruments, and then the key question is what you do with the money. I have seen a situation, I remember in Zimbabwe, where fund managers were supposed to prescribe to certain government assets, and that money became part of Treasury's budget. So the money just got swallowed into a big black hole, and it wasn't directed at specific areas where it was able to make a difference.
And that's one of the really strong counter arguments. But government can do that anyhow. And that's why I'm trying to make the distinction between, as things currently stand, we, to a large degree, we look to the credit rating agencies, but they use the same methodologies across the world. They don't make any special adjustments for South Africa. They need to be consistent to do their job. And whereas if you go down the prescribed assets approach, then you really are pulling in the asset managers sort of in direct confrontation with the finance ministry to say, okay, now how do we take the economy forward? And it's going to put a lot of pressure on the asset managers and perhaps more broadly even into the banking sector to be more creative about transformation.
Yeah.
And I would argue vehemently there's a lot of potential. There's some players doing some very exciting things, but that's very much the exception among South Africa's financial services companies in terms of transformation and economic development.
Yeah. Francois, feel free to contribute to that thought as well. But I wanted to ask you, I mean, South Africa's National Treasury has shown itself to be a very capable manager of state resources thus far. Is there a danger, though, that it could be overwhelmed by the ideologues in terms of using these resources should they be acquired through the prescribed assets method?
No, I don't think so. I think so far Minister Nene has looked very capable of holding his ground against some of his more ideological or leftist colleagues. I think the problem isn't so much there as in slippage which results from misspending, having to bail out public companies, massive contracts that we only now starting to find out how much those are going to cost. Things that already happened in the past that he can't have any control over. So I think I'm quite optimistic about Treasury's political clout in cabinets, but yeah, there are, especially in the SOEs, there's a lot of leakage, and that can still cause trouble. But speaking of ratings agencies, I think the government is very conscious of the danger of another ratings downgrade and what that's going to mean for a government's own ability to finance itself. So I think if it comes to that, if it becomes clear that any more slippage or bailouts would mean a downgrade, then I think caution will win the day.
Are there countries that have successfully gone this route that perhaps the ANC could look at and use as examples?
Not that I know of, no.
Not that I know of.
No, I very much agree with Francois. I mean, just one example. I think South Africa is remarkably unique. You had 80% of the population which was politically disenfranchised, and suddenly that changed 21 years ago. So no other country has had that sort of challenge. And you've had 21 years of efforts for transformation, and now what's happening because of what's going on with commodity markets and overly indebted consumers is, I'd say, the game is getting away from the ANC, and that's why something reasonably dramatic pretty much has to happen.
I think that instead of big winners, I think a more productive strategy would be something that the government pays lip service to, is the development of smaller enterprises, smaller, medium, and micro enterprises. But we haven't seen any movement on legislation that can help in that regard. And I think, again, this is where the old trade unions presence in government is counterproductive, because there's a sense in which government tends to think of business as, you know, factories and mines and business capital against labor. So there isn't enough exploration, I don't think, of a model of cooperative work where like in Germany, for instance, or Singapore works like that. Unions have representation on boards, yeah, and they have a profit share. I think that could help. But you know, there's a lot of good ideas everywhere that you can look at. But I think what we lack in this country is a consistency and implementation.
That was Shaun Hagedorn, an independent strategy advisor, and Francois Conradi, a political analyst at NKC Independent Economist.